This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. After days of conflict, delegations from Russia and Ukraine are now meeting at a site along Belarusian-Ukrainian border, where they are negotiating core issues of a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops. To take a close look at the talks and the latest events of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I'm glad to be joined by Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy of Tsinghua University, Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian defense analyst, and Peter Clapp, director of the Brussels Liberty Network. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. So we'll start with Zhou Bo. I guess the negotiation is ongoing right now since no results is being reported yet. So what's your expectation of the negotiation?
Well, I don't believe, I hope there would be good outcome, but I've just read New York Times, the Ukrainian president actually is not so confident about the outcome because it seems that the fighting is still going on and there is no sign of de-escalation. So, but after all, talking is still better than no talking at all. Hopefully something positive might come out of this talk.
Well, Pavel, obviously they have different expectations or requests, let's say. For the Ukrainian side, it's really about the ceasefire and also withdrawal of Russian troops. But for Russia, it's about the demilitarization or neutral status of Ukraine. Is there any possibility for them to reach a compromise?
Well, that compromise or even an agreement the possibility seems rather slim right now. The composition of the delegation is also, both delegations actually, is not very promising. The Ukrainian delegation is led by their defense minister, who's of course not a military person, but a politician, and who's rather outspoken about talking about continued resistance and fighting the enemy. And the Russian delegation is led by aide to President Putin, Medinsky, who's actually was Minister of Culture and now is an aide on culture, though he maybe is a specialist in military history, but not really a person who can give orders to troops. And the defense ministry is not represented by really combat generals who would be needed to sign a kind of ceasefire agreement. So I believe it will be just more or less an exchange of views, or it's even worse, it could be that both sides want to demonstrate to the general public in the world that they, each side separately, are for negotiations and ready to talk, while in fact they are not really ready. That could be the outcome, that they'll just agree to disagree.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, what do you make of the negotiation? So probably, nothing specific will come out of the negotiation, basically a gesture of somehow like we are negotiating, but at the same time we're still fighting on the battleground.
Well, I think the most important thing about it is that the negotiations have been requested by the Russian side. And this is clearly because the invasion, the aggression is not going as planned. It has sort of exposed Russia as a military power that is clearly less powerful as many people assumed across the globe. Now, what to expect practically, as is mentioned, I don't think we should put our expectations very high. In the very best scenario, this will lead to some kind of very temporary ceasefire, for example, to exchange dead bodies, because quite a few Russians have unfortunately already died on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the case, then there's an issue, Peter, obviously. It's not only between Russia and Ukraine. There's the issue of like whether European countries and the United States and NATO, whether they are supportive of a negotiation with the Russian side, right? Are they ready to negotiate, a ceasefire probably?
Well, absolutely. I think if a ceasefire would be on the table, I'm 100% sure the West would back that. I mean, everybody wants this to stop. I mean, what we could see over the weekend really is dramatic action in the West, from really big sanctions to Germany announcing to increase its military budget back to 1990 levels. I mean, this is very crucial. I think we can even expect Germany to go back to nuclear power. I mean, at least the green ministers in Germany are open to that possibility, and it's really a no-brainer because it's pure madness for Germany to shut down its nuclear plants, which is the plan by the end of this year, and to become even more reliant on Russia. So I think more is to come. I mean, we have seen massive sanctions that are unfortunately going to hurt the Russian middle class very hard. This is experimental. I mean, let's hope at least Putin will reflect on what he's doing, but I don't think we can guarantee that.
Well, you mentioned several points. We'll come back to the, I would say this is really momentous change in terms of the gesture as well as the attitudes, in Germany and other European countries toward the development. But in terms of the sanctions, Pavel, you are now in Moscow. Share with us, how impactful those sanction measures are working, affecting probably people, residents in Moscow.
Well, I would say it's shock and awe. No one was really expecting that sanctions would hit so hard and so swiftly, because no one was actually expecting that the West jointly would begin freezing effectively the assets of the Russian central bank. Apparently, the idea was that Russia has a large international currency sanctions and international currency reserves, and that's a pillar of security, and that Russia will be able to survive sanctions, which were expected, like some big banks being switched off from SWIFT and having individual sanctions and technological sanctions. Russia had reserves of components and so on, but the central bank hit like that. Today in Moscow, the ruble is in free fall. The central bank just increased by 10.5% its lending rate from 9.5% to 20%. That's an act of desperation, I would say, and that's of course a 20% exchange rate of lending rate. And of course, industry will have to pay more, 25, 30. That would kill Russian industry. We're heading into a very severe depression, and very soon.
Yes.
And there will be shortages in the stores, and there's going to be, and of course, gadgets are not working. Credit cards are failing. This is a kind of, Moscow is really in shock of what is happening, and it happened immediately, not in 3 months or half a year.
Well, Pavel, there are talk about, or even guesses about, what's the purpose of the sanctions. Of course, on one hand, it's really about, trying to force the Russian side to move back their troops. On the other hand, then there are guesses like whether that's a regime change move, basically to create chaos, create troubles inside Russia, and then to create serious challenges to President Putin.
Well, the challenge for President Putin is going to be, it's clear, the Russian stock exchange was falling all last week, but stock exchange in Russia is not that really important. I mean, not many Russians have stocks, and they don't really follow, like the Americans follow the Dow Jones. But the exchange rate of the dollar and the euro, that's what almost every Russian looks at, because almost lots of Russians have some kind of money stocked away in foreign currency or in a bank account. And so, yes, it's going to have internal repercussions. This war was not very popular to begin with. there were dissenting voices even in the military. Those who were speaking publicly were retired military figures, but they still were saying that this is a wrong idea to attack Ukraine, go into such an all-out war, that this is wrong. And apparently the Russian military is not fighting as it was expected. And maybe that's also because there's reluctance within the ranks and maybe within the commanding officers to really pursue this war with all vigor. It's hard to say, but the Russian military performance is also not very up to standard that it was expected.
Well, Joe Bo,
So that means there are going to be problems with political internal problems in Russia are inevitable.
yeah, there are a lot of factors at play right now. You know, the sanctions, the sentiment, and also whether how popular that war is inside and outside Russia. Joe Bo, if you look at this battleground, with the information available right now, what do you make of the progress of the Russian military operations? Is it moving according to the schedule, or somehow behind the schedule, or do the Russians expect strong resistance from Ukraine, at least seemingly?
Well, I think the Russians didn't achieve the strategic objective as much as they wish. Well, actually, I was quite attentive to Pavel's comments about how within the Russian military, people even have different views about why and how this all-out war should be conducted. So this is interesting for me. At least we have read newspapers. We know that it is not as smooth as the Russians wish. But I believe it also has a lot of things to do with the resistance from the Ukrainian side. And even the president have actually shown kind of a stamina by refusing to leave, by taking to the street, to call on the solidarity of the Ukrainian people. But eventually, I believe, so long as the war continues, because the Russian armed forces certainly outnumber and outgun the Ukrainian forces. So it's only a matter of how long the Ukrainian side could actually last. Eventually, they will lose.
Okay, speak of that, Joe, but you have to notice that there's a growing assistance from Western countries, from European countries, from the United States, for example, missiles, sniper rifles, and ammunition to assist Ukrainian forces, as well as, of course, financial and medical support. So how large a role that kind of assistance might play in helping the Ukrainians against the Russian forces?
I believe the role is limited, and it's actually more symbolic. Because if you think logically, for example, and what kind of weapons could be delivered, and how they could be delivered, and how they could actually be delivered to the very people who would handle them. If they are talking about sniper rifle, then would it be given to Ukrainian soldier or even to the civilians? It's not something that a civilian could use. Sniper rifle is just a precision in a targeted weapon system, shooting at a certain target. And there could be differences in the different standard, because this kind of Western weapons are not necessarily the one that are used by Ukrainian soldiers, let alone Ukrainian civilians. And so how could they be delivered? For example, the war is going on. So with all this combined, it raises actually many questions. So I believe more or less this is simply a symbolic gesture with limited significance, if any.
Related to the assistance from European countries or EU, Peter, there's about I think it's like a gesture from der Leyen that the EU membership is open to Ukraine, and then there's a demand from Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that immediate access into the European Union. How likely that is? He a bit naive, or is he somehow overestimating the assistance from the European Union?
Well, what President Zelensky has said is basically repeating what he has said in the past and what Ukrainians have said in the past, that they would love to join both the European Union and NATO. So there's no news in that, and it's understandable. However, what the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said that Ukraine would be welcome to join the European Union. That is not something that is backed by EU member states or by a majority in a democratic majority in European Union member states. Now, people wish Ukraine well. There's a huge sympathy for Ukraine, especially now in this conflict, but already before. But because of the fact that Ukraine is still struggling with what you could call oligarchism, that there's a lot of corruption and other reasons. There's no democratic majority in EU member states to allow them either into NATO or into the EU. And on top of that, another reason why there is no support for that is simply realpolitik, because people are afraid that they would anger Russia. And I think it's not something that is always said so openly, but it's a reality. And we have seen that Russia does not consider, or at least the Russian leadership, the current Russian leadership, does not consider Ukraine to be a real country. And that is an element you have to take into account, whether you invite Ukraine into the EU or into
Or
NATO.
NATO, yes.
So I suspect that this is not something that is gonna change anytime soon. What Europe will probably be seeking, for example, French President Macron has been promoting that, is to have some kind of a long-term settlement between the West, Ukraine, and Russia, which would involve Ukraine to become some kind of a neutral Switzerland-style buffer state, which would also involve that Russia would actually not intervene in any way in Ukraine. So I think in a way that would not be such a bad outcome for Ukraine on the long term, even if I can completely understand that they would love to be a member of the EU and NATO.
But yeah, but probably not that realistic. From the Russian side, Pavel, President Putin has ordered his military to put Russia's nuclear deterrence forces on high alert. What is the consideration behind that order, that move?
Well, apparently, and Putin said so, that's a reaction to these sudden and so drastic sanctions, like freezing the assets of the central bank, which basically is a kind of already a war move, at least. Such things happen mostly when war is already kind of happening, when you seize the assets of an enemy country. So what was that ordered? It's the kind of equivalent of the American White House military going to another level of DEFCON. Well, it was once at 2 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, once at 3, actually in the 73 in the Middle East. Russia also has a system of levels of readiness, though unlike the American DEFCON, which has been published, though the details have not, on each level of readiness. Russia also has a similar system, so we went at least one notch closer to nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
The actual nitty-gritty of what that means in terms of, rules of engagement, that's yet not clear, but this is a direct threat to the West that Russia believes its core interests are being attacked, and that it may result to use of nuclear weapons. There have been scenarios about, say, having a demonstrative explosion, say, sending some kind of long-range cruise missile to explode, say, over the open sea somewhere.
How likely is it, Pavel, we are going to see the use of a nuclear warhead?
Well, let's say it's possible, say, hitting somewhere where it won't hurt, over the sea, where there's nothing. In the air, that would not cause practically any fallout, but that will demonstrate to the West how Russia seriously sees the situation, and the understanding here that that may be a kind of demonstration of last resort to force the West to begin to back down from, say, release the central bank assets or something like that, or begin serious negotiations about that. So, but anyway, this is a very important move. It's not clear will the Americans follow by also moving a notch on their DEFCON. It's not always announced. Sometimes it's done without announcement. But this is a kind of, we began to kind of slip, or we're on the beginning of a slippery slope that could lead to a global nuclear war. In the end, of course, is still a very remote possibility, but it's not zero.
Not zero. Zhou Bo, related to that development, over the weekend, there's a referendum in Belarus. There, basically, the country is going to change its status, a non-nuclear status. And so, how impactful that move is in terms of security, probably European countries would feel threatened because of that move. But that move, a lot of people say that is basically opening the door to station some nuclear forces, Russian nuclear forces inside that country. What do you make of that?
Well, listening to all this conversation about the possible use of nuclear weapons is really alarming to Chinese, because China, of course, is a nuclear weapon state, but Russia is the country that has the largest nuclear arsenal. And I understand historically, Russia once pledged no further use of nuclear weapons, but now they certainly have a long time ago they have changed this policy. So from Chinese perspective, I mean, nuclear weapons are only for deterrence. It's not really for use. And this is why China has been advocating no further use of nuclear weapons. And actually this idea has resonated to some extent even in the United States. I read the New York Times recently, and I found that actually there are more than 1,000 engineers and scientists, including 21 Nobel laureates who advocated to President Biden to adopt this no further use policy. So I understand how Russia want to show that they are really serious about the situation, but still this should not be encouraged. And I believe this kind of remarks may just have a great impact on the world as a whole. It might prove to DPRK what they are doing is exactly right, right? Mm-hmm. And it may just serve as a kind of stimulus to countries with potential nuclear ambitions. For example, people have been talking about countries even like Saudi Arabia wishing to have nuclear weapons. So the world will definitely change drastically if this kind of massive potential use of nuclear weapons are encouraged. This is dangerous.
This is dangerous indeed. Also, Peter, if you look at, as you mentioned earlier, the response from European countries, their positions are being hardened, let's say, to say the least. For example, Germany has broken its policy of not sending lethal weapons to conflict zones, and Switzerland, a neutral country, let's say, is now considering freezing Russian assets. That's a stark reversal of their neutrality. So that's a long-term change, let's say. It's not a short-term response to the war in Ukraine, Peter?
Yes, I think so. We could also see Sweden sending some military aid to Ukraine. Sweden is also neutral in theory. We could see weapons being purchased not by the EU budget, but by sort of a joint EU fund, technically separate from the EU budget. So a lot of taboos are being broken. Perhaps over the last few days, if I can single out one taboo that is, let's say, most remarkable, it's indeed the assets of the Russian central bank that are being frozen. Some of these assets, that's not entirely certain, but are likely held by the German central bank, the Bundesbank. I mean, and we could see, as Pavel said, immediate effect on the street in Moscow. So this is sort of you could argue a very potent financial weapon. Again, the consequences are very big. Is it wise to use it? Of course, Putin has been very aggressive, and this is actually unacceptable. But I think we always have to think, will a certain measure actually deliver a positive outcome or not? I mean, for now, energy has been shielded from the sanctions, so European countries are still keen to buy energy from Russia. In theory, Russia could suspend energy transfers or commodities, gas, oil, whatnot, to the West. But then, of course, it would sort of cut off a lot of income it needs to continue wage this particular war and to try to sustain its financial system. So just to say, we haven't reached the end of the sanctions escalations just yet. So
Okay.
let's hope that at least people around Putin are
So
starting
there
to
are
reflect.
more sanctions expected. So Pavel, if you look at the big picture of this conflict, of course, one of the requests from the Russian side is really about probably the pause of NATO eastward expansion, including this Ukrainians NATO membership. NATO was a defense alliance built against the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, but all those have been gone. What is why NATO continue to expand, and how do Russia sees that as a threat, right?
Well, Russia has seen it as a threat because NATO doesn't have any other real mission as to kind of deter and Russia. They tried in the 90s to find other missions, but that was not very successful, ended up in Afghanistan with the Afghan debacle. So now again they have their core mission back. Maybe in headquarters in Brussels they're happy because NATO is united by a single enemy. But that means that Europe is divided and that we have a very serious crisis on our hands now with possible catastrophic results in the future. But even if we manage to de-escalate right now, we can have a similar crisis happening further on down the road because the standoff will apparently continue. And that's the bad thing really is that right now we have a divided Europe, divided militarily, politically, economically increasingly, and that means that Europe, which was the source of 2 world wars and lots of wars before that, is again a source of world instability. I mean, it's not the Korean Peninsula, it's not Asia or Africa, it's Europe back again, and Europe is much more dangerous.
We have like less than 1 minute. Zhou, there's a suggestion like China may play a role, China basically standing in the middle. So China probably also have influence over Russia, over Ukraine, and have a strong relationship with European countries, the US. Can China play a role to bring the countries together to talk to each other instead of fighting?
Well, I think China's role would become more important simply because the United States wants China to stand on its side, which is impossible. But Russia, of course, in this time of crisis, also wants China's support. China would have a great friendship with Russia, but there is a limit. That is, China and Russia would not become allies. That is for sure. And China, while understanding Russia's a legitimate concern about NATO's external expansion, however, would still stress on this issue of sovereignty. So talking about the future of Europe, I believe the situation has totally changed. Eventually, it will come into another Cold War situation in Europe.
So with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. To continue following the latest development in Ukraine, you can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.